I laughed, almost out of habit, trying to shake off the sudden surge of anxiety in my chest. Josh, you ate mushrooms. It's impossible to die from mushrooms, I told myself, clinging to some scrap of logic. But even as I said it, I could hear how hollow it sounded. That fragile assurance shattered in an instant. It was as if the air itself paused. A presence filled the room, not imagined, not metaphorical, and I heard a voice, calm, yet carrying the weight of eternity. Who says I can't stop your heart whenever I want? In that moment, the temperature seemed to drop, and the shadows in the corners of the room felt suddenly alive. It wasn't just darkness, it was a darkness that noticed me, a darkness that had been waiting. If you've ever read the old accounts from early church martyrs, those moments when a condemned Christian stands in the arena, realizing the gates are about to open, you understand the helpless clarity that floods in. I knew in my spirit that the line had been crossed, and there was no taking it back. But this wasn't the beginning of my story. The scene cuts, and suddenly I'm back in the familiar setting of a testimony interview. A plain backdrop, a single camera, the quiet hum of studio lights. The host welcomes me. Joshua, welcome back to Delafay Testimonies. We're grateful you've returned. Your first testimony reached so many people. For those who haven't met you before, can you briefly share how you came to surrender your life to Jesus? I leaned forward, hands clasped, searching for the simplest way to sum up the years that came before. My name's Josh. I'm 29. My story started in a bad place. Mental illness and addiction from around age 12. That spiraled into a 15-year stretch of drugs, arrests, jail time, and psych wards. Around 2017, everything collapsed. I was homeless, hitting what I thought was the bottom. In jail, I cried out to Jesus, and he answered. I had an encounter that changed me completely. From that point on, he began restoring everything my addictions had stolen. For centuries, Christians have stood in public and told their salvation testimonies, personal accounts of how Christ found them in their lowest moment. In the ancient church, these confessions were more than stories. They were warnings, encouragements, and sometimes the last words of those about to face persecution. Mine wasn't spoken from a prison cell or a Roman court, but the impulse was the same. Tell the truth, so someone else doesn't walk into the same fire. The host nods. For anyone who wants to see the full story, the link will be in the description. But today, what's the testimony you want to share? And that's when I say it, the confession that will carry the next hour of the conversation. I want to talk about the time I took mushrooms after I'd been walking with Christ. Even now, there's a strange weight in my chest saying those words, because this wasn't some slip back into old habits. This was deliberate. This was me convincing myself I had a reason, and that reason, as twisted as it would turn out to be, began months before that night. Before anyone ever heard me speak about Christ, before the street preaching and the miracles, there was the other life, the long, bruising descent. I was 12 when the first cracks appeared. At that age, most kids are worrying about middle school grades or trying to fit into a friend group. I was already carrying the early weight of mental illness and addiction. It began innocently, the way poison often does, small, subtle, wearing the disguise of relief. A pill here, a drink there, the buzz of escape from thoughts I didn't want to sit with. The America I grew up in was already deep in the throes of a youth drug culture that was mutating. The opioid crisis was climbing. Prescription painkillers were being traded in school bathrooms. Cheap weed, synthetic highs, party pills, they were everywhere, like they were waiting for you to have a bad day so they could step in and offer comfort. For me, it escalated fast. The first taste of altered reality is never enough. It plants the question, what else is out there? By my mid-teens, I was moving through substances like stations on a dark pilgrimage. Drugs weren't just a weekend thing. They became the air I breathed, the way I related to the world. And with them came the other things. Jail cells, fluorescent-lit rehab centers, the cold metal of handcuffs. I knew the smell of stale institutional food, the sound of a key turning in a door behind you, the shuffle of other addicts telling their stories while trying to convince themselves they'd stay clean this time. I can remember the padded walls of a psych ward room, the sense that you've been set aside from the rest of the human race because no one knows what to do with you anymore. I remember being 3A, awake, staring at a ceiling tile, wondering how I'd gotten this far gone before I was even 20. 15 years passed like that, years that weren't really lived so much as endured. I became fluent in the language of survival, manipulating, hiding, finding the next high. I lost jobs, burned bridges, cut ties with family. Every choice cost me something, but the bill never seemed to stop coming. By 2017, the bottom had finally arrived, though in truth it had been coming for a long time. I was homeless, not sleeping on a friend's couch, homeless, but carrying everything you own in a bag, homeless. Nights under bridges, days where the only plan was to make it to the next. The world had stopped offering options. And then came the arrest, another set of cuffs, another holding cell, but this time, in that place of absolute defeat, something cracked open in me that no drug, no high, no therapist had been able to reach. I cried out. It wasn't a rehearsed prayer. It wasn't eloquent. It was more like the groan of someone drowning, a wordless plea from somewhere deeper than thought. And God heard me. It's one of those truths that's as old as scripture, but still catches you off guard when it happens to you. The same God who listened to thieves and beggars in the first century heard a homeless addict in a county jail in 2017. The encounter is hard to explain without cheapening it with too many words. All I can say is that I met him there, and when I walked out, I didn't walk out alone. From 2017 to 2018, it was a slow, stubborn rebuilding. I wasn't just clean, I was alive in a way I'd never been. God began restoring what I destroyed. Relationships, health, even the sense that I had a future. Everything the addictions had swallowed began to come back into view, piece by piece. But as I would learn later, even after a miracle, the heart is still vulnerable to questions, and sometimes the enemy waits years before planting the one that will test you the most. When I came out of jail in 2017, my faith wasn't something I eased into. It was like being thrown into a rushing river. I didn't want to just believe. I wanted to live it, breathe it, see what God could do if I went all in. Within weeks, I found myself in the streets, not as a wanderer anymore, but as a witness. I was preaching the gospel on sidewalks, in parks, outside bus stations. If someone made eye contact, I'd start a conversation. If someone didn't, I'd still find a way. It was messy, raw, and alive. In those first 2.5 years, I saw things I couldn't explain in any way except through God. People healed. People delivered. Words came to me about strangers' lives that I had no way of knowing. I prayed for addicts on curbs, and some of them felt the chains break instantly. I saw fear leave people's faces like someone had switched on a light inside them. To someone who's never been there, miracle can sound like a metaphor, but for me, it wasn't abstract. It was Tuesday night on a corner in a bad part of town, watching someone's eyes widen because the pain in their body just left. And yet, there was a cost. It wasn't the kind of ministry you could do on weekends and then slip back into a quiet life. The more I said yes to God, the more I started losing things. Jobs didn't last because I was out in the streets when others wanted me on a shift. Friendships faded, some because they didn't understand, others because they understood too well and didn't want the conviction it brought. Even family ties strained under the weight of it. The gospel sounds beautiful until it starts asking you to give up something you love. I told myself it was all worth it, and in many ways, it was. But there's a hidden strain in this kind of life, one they don't often talk about in testimonies. When you're constantly pouring yourself out, telling people with confidence that Jesus is the only way, the enemy will eventually test whether you actually believe that with every fiber of your being. And sometimes, the testing doesn't come in the form of a direct attack. Sometimes it starts as a whisper of curiosity, a small question that feels harmless. For me, that whisper was already forming, though I didn't recognize it yet. The stage was set. I had faith, I had seen power, I had endured cost, but I was about to find out how easily a seed of doubt can grow if you don't watch the soil of your own heart. It didn't happen all at once. Doubt rarely does. At first, it was just an aftertaste, a flicker of unease after a conversation with someone who believed differently. Street evangelism meant talking to all kinds of people: hardened skeptics, self-styled philosophers, people whose worldviews were stitched together from religion, science, and their own private visions. And because of where I'd come from, the open-minded swirl of New Age spirituality, conspiracy culture, and self-discovery books, I could understand their language. I could see why they thought the way they did. But understanding is a double-edged sword. It's one thing to know why someone believes differently. It's another to start feeling a pang when you tell them they're wrong. Even if you don't say the words out loud, you hear yourself thinking, what if they're not entirely wrong? What if there's more than one path? That thought lingered longer than I wanted to admit. Because here's the truth. It is costly to live like Christ is the only way. Costly in relationships, in comfort, in reputation. There were days I felt like a soldier who had marched too long without rest. And on those days, when you're tired, you're vulnerable. I found myself saying to God in quiet moments, I know you're real. I know you're my king. But how do I know you're the only king? How do I know there isn't another way? That's a dangerous prayer if you're not ready for the answer. It was subtle at first, but over time I noticed something else. God didn't seem to work for everyone the way he had for me. I'd meet people who told me they had prayed. They had called on Jesus, but their lives still looked like the same wilderness. No dramatic rescue, no instant freedom, just more struggle. I couldn't shake it. If God could split my chain so quickly, why not theirs? I began to think of faith like a weapon, one you don't really know the strength of until you take it into battle. And I'd been in battle long enough to see that some shields seemed to break, some swords bent under pressure. The easy faith you carry on Sunday mornings is different from the kind you need when you step into the dirt and start swinging. The quiet rise of doubt is not a shout, it's a slow leak, and mine had begun. At the time, I didn't know it was leading me towards something that would put me right in the middle of a spiritual trap. All I knew was that I was looking for more certainty, and that I was willing to test boundaries to get it. It was just another day online. At least, that's how it began. Scrolling through videos, half distracted, when a thumbnail caught my eye. The title suggested something so strange, so unlikely, that I clicked almost without thinking. The forgotten Christian sect that used mushrooms in worship. The video was a mix of grainy images, academic-sounding narration, and bold claims. According to it, somewhere in the tangled history of the early church, there had been believers who incorporated psychedelic mushrooms into their spiritual practice. I remember leaning back in my chair, frowning, then leaning forward again. This wasn't the first time I'd heard of drugs and religion intersecting. Far from it. My past had been steeped in the romanticized stories of shamans in the Amazon drinking ayahuasca to commune with spirits, or indigenous tribes using peyote in their rituals. But this was different. This was tied to my faith. And here's the thing about curiosity. It rarely barges in shouting. It slips in like an uninvited guest, and if you let it sit in the corner long enough, it starts asking questions you didn't plan on answering. Mushrooms, for me, had always belonged in a separate mental category from drugs. In my old life, drugs meant heroin, meth, cocaine, the substances that came with death in their shadow. Psychedelics, that they had worn the costume of medicine. They had been praised as teachers, doorways, even healers. The strange part was, some of that felt true. Back then, psychedelics had shown me things about myself, truths I couldn't deny, convictions about being a better brother, a better son, a more honest man. They had given me moments of piercing self-awareness, but along with those truths came an equal measure of lies, subtle, poisonous, and just believable enough to keep me in bondage. It was like being fed from two bowls at the same time, one with real food, one with poison, and never knowing which bite would be which. As I watched that video, I felt the old intrigue stirring. What if it's not as dangerous as I thought? What if it's just another tool God made, and we've misunderstood it? That seed didn't sprout overnight. It sank quietly into the soil of my mind, where my prayers about it were more subconscious than deliberate. History, I've learned, is full of seductive half-truths like this. Entire movements have been built on a single what if that slipped past someone's guard. And as much as I wanted to think I was immune, that my years walking with Christ had made me unshakable, I was already entertaining the thought. Not to get high, not to escape. No, I told myself, this would be for the truth, for the kingdom. That's how the trap is baited. The idea didn't feel reckless at first. It felt strategic. I told myself I wasn't chasing a high. I wasn't looking to relive the old chaos. This would be an expedition, a mission into the spirit realm to gather intelligence, the way a soldier slips behind enemy lines. I imagined it almost like undercover work. I would enter their territory armed with the authority of Christ, demand the spirits reveal themselves, and then return with first-hand knowledge to rescue others trapped in deception. It sounded noble in my head. Looking back, it was a textbook example of twisting scripture into a weapon against yourself. I remembered Paul saying he became all things to all men, so that by all means some might be saved. But somewhere between the verse and my reasoning, I had removed the guardrails. I ignored the other side of the biblical witness, the repeated warnings about not testing the Lord, not opening forbidden doors. That's the subtle danger of spiritual pride. You think your calling makes you untouchable. For months, the thought sat there, ripening. I'd pray about it, though pray might be too generous a word. In truth, I was talking at God, explaining my plan, the way a child explains to his father why it's fine to play near the cliff's edge. God, I'd say in the quiet of my mind, I know the truth now. I walk in the Spirit. I can discern lies from reality. Let me go in there and drag them into the light. I can handle it. The thing about pride is that it often borrows the vocabulary of courage. And all the while, I carried this belief. The reason I no longer touched heroin was because God had shown me its death, up close. The reason I no longer watched pornography was because I had felt its darkness. So, with psychedelics, what was holding me back? Fear. And fear, I told myself, was weakness. It didn't matter that the fear was there for a reason, that it was, in fact, a warning. In my mind, fear was a challenge. If it scared me, I needed to confront it. What I couldn't see then was that this confrontation wasn't bravery at all. It was me stepping willingly into a battlefield I wasn't sent to, under the illusion that my own wisdom was enough to get me out again. The trap wasn't sprung yet, but the bait was already in my mouth. It happened on a night that didn't look dangerous at all. No flicker of lightning on the horizon, no warning sirens. I was headed to a friend's place, someone I'd known for years, to record music. That was our rhythm. I'd come by, we'd lay down tracks, I'd leave. He was the kind of friend whose life was still tangled in the things I'd left behind. He sold weed, dabbled in other deals, but I told myself I could navigate it. I'd just keep my head down, do the work, and go home. The smell of stale smoke hung in the air the moment I stepped in. A beat pulsed faintly from a speaker in the next room. The house had that restless, in-between energy. Not quite a party, not quite peace. I sat on the edge of the bed, notebook in hand, mind halfway on the lyrics I was about to record. And then he walked in, holding a bag. Not just any bag. A bag heavy enough to sag in his grip, full enough to spill its contents onto the bed without effort. Mushrooms, dozens of them, their caps and stems a dull, knowing color under the lamp. It's strange how quickly the world can shift. One moment, you're thinking about rhyme schemes. The next, you're staring at the very thing you've been circling in your thoughts for months. He didn't push them on me. That's the thing. Temptation often doesn't need to shove. He just set them down like they were part of the scenery, made a casual comment about them, and went about his business. But his tone had that slight, upward lilt, the kind that plants a seed without ever asking a question outright. My stomach tightened. I could feel my pulse in my throat. This was the door. The reasons I'd avoided heroin or other drugs were clear in my mind. I'd seen the death in them, but psychedelics, I hadn't closed that chapter with the same finality. Instead, I'd left a bookmark. And the truth was, there was fear there. I didn't like that fear. It felt like a shadow I needed to walk through. The room felt smaller, the air denser. I glanced at the pile again. My mind split between the years I'd been free and the voice whispering that this was the moment to prove something, to God, to myself, maybe even to the darkness. I don't remember a long deliberation. It came out almost like a dare to my own soul. Now or never. And with that, I crossed the threshold. I wish I could tell you I prayed for an hour, wrestling in the spirit before I decided. I didn't. The bag sat there like an open invitation, the caps and stems spilling out in their mottled, earthy tones, almost humble looking, like they didn't know the kind of doors they could open. I told myself it wasn't rebellion. This was intentional. I wasn't here to chase a high or to escape the weight of reality. I was here to confront the darkness, to take my authority in Christ into a place most believers were too afraid to step. It's amazing how easily you can dress disobedience in the robes of mission. I picked up one of the pieces. It was smaller than I remembered, lighter. My fingers felt dry against its brittle surface. Somewhere in the back of my mind, a voice whispered, "You could still walk away." Another voice answered, "If you walk away now, you'll never know." I thought about all the other things I'd given up without hesitation. Heroin, porn, the addictions that had once ruled me. I'd been able to slam those doors shut because I'd seen their end. But this, psychedelics still had a shimmer of mystery, and mystery can be intoxicating. Fear flickered in me like a warning light on the dashboard, and instead of slowing down, I pressed the gas. I'd convinced myself that fear was proof I needed to do this. So I said it aloud, almost like a pact. "All right, God, let's do this thing." It wasn't the first time I'd taken mushrooms. In my past life, I'd consumed them over 100 times, along with acid and DMT. I'd done heavy doses, navigated chaotic situations while tripping, even dealt with the police mid-high without losing my composure. Psychedelics had never beaten me before. And that was the most dangerous thought of all. I took the small chocolate square, the one hiding a measured eighth, and ate it. Bitter, earthy, gone in seconds. No flash of lightning, no trumpet of warning, just the same music in the background, the same dim room, the same me, except now. The clock had started ticking. It started the way it always did, a faint hum in the body, a slight tightening in the chest, not from panic, but from awareness. My thoughts felt like they were standing a little taller inside my mind, looking around. There's always a point in a mushroom trip where you can feel the curtain beginning to move, just slightly. The world hasn't changed yet, but you can sense that it's thinking about it. I told myself to stay grounded, positive mindset, good music. Let the beats guide me into a smooth ride. My friend queued up some tracks, and I began to relax, letting the rhythm stitch itself into my thoughts. Then, 20 minutes in, he broke the flow. "Hey," he said casually, "you want to go to the bar? The guys are heading over." I stared at him like he'd just asked if I wanted to walk into a war zone. "No, man. Not right now. I'm staying here." He shrugged. No argument. No judgment. "All right, I'm gonna head out then." It was such an ordinary moment, but the way he grabbed his keys, the way the door closed behind him, it felt like the scene in a play where a character leaves the stage so the real drama can begin. I didn't realize it then, but that was the pivot. The moment the atmosphere in the room shifted, as soon as the sound of his footsteps faded, the air seemed to change temperature. My ears felt too open, like they were hearing more than just the quiet. It was as if something had been waiting for him to leave. I brushed it off. This was just the trip coming on. I'd felt these sensations before, the heightened awareness, the strange focus on the invisible. I told myself, don't lean into it, just ride the wave. But the room didn't agree. The corners felt heavier. The silence between the music beats seemed to stretch longer than it should. And somewhere deep in my spirit, I felt a small, undeniable shift, the sense that I was no longer alone, and that whatever had just entered wasn't here to be friendly. At first, I tried to treat it like background noise, that faint hum of darkness at the edges of my awareness. I'd felt bad vibes before, on psychedelics, and learned how to push through. Keep the music playing, keep your thoughts light, don't give the shadows anything to feed on. But this was different. It wasn't just a mood, it was movement. Not movement in the air, but in the unseen. One by one, I could sense arrivals. The way you can feel a person step into a room even before you hear their footfall. These presences didn't brush past me or acknowledge me. They circled, slow and deliberate, as though taking inventory of their prey. Pressure began to coil around my chest, as if invisible hands were resting there, testing how much weight it would take to crush me. My breathing shortened. I told myself to shake it off. I even laughed out loud, forcing cheer into my voice. I walked into the bathroom, looked in the mirror, and started naming my blessings, my health, my marriage, my restored life, like a pep talk could drown out whatever was pressing closer. The reflection stared back at me, my pupils already wide, my smile just a little too tight. I muttered the words again. Josh, you ate mushrooms. It's impossible to die from mushrooms. And then, as if my words had summoned it, the voice came. Not a whisper, not a suggestion, but a statement that landed in my spirit with the weight of an anvil. Who says I can't stop your heart whenever I want? The moment it spoke, it was as if the walls of the room exhaled something foul and ancient. The light seemed weaker, the floor felt farther away, and the darkness stopped pretending to be shy. I knew instantly. This wasn't just a bad trip. This was presence, evil, patient, and fully aware that I had opened the door and let it in. I began to pray in tongues, the words spilling out in a rush, not from ritual but from sheer desperation. Every time I prayed, the crushing sensation eased just enough for me to breathe. When I paused, even for a second, it came rushing back, thicker, heavier, more insistent. I was an hour in, and already I understood the real trip had only just started, and I had made a colossal mistake. The pressure wouldn't lift, even with the praying, even with every ounce of willpower I could scrape together. It felt like I was slowly losing ground. The air in that room had the density of water now. Every breath felt stolen, not given. I thought of one possible escape, get out, change the atmosphere. Maybe if I left this place, whatever had its grip on me would loosen. I remembered my wife was out with friends for dinner. I grabbed my phone, fingers clumsy against the screen, and called her. My voice came out strained, more urgent than I meant it to sound. You've got to come get me. Please, just come get me. She didn't ask many questions. She just said she'd be there soon. 20 minutes, maybe 30. By the time she arrived, it felt like hours. When I stepped into the night air, it didn't bring the relief I hoped for. The darkness followed like a shadow stitched to my skin. I climbed into the passenger seat, trying to act normal for a moment, but she could see it immediately. My chest was rising too fast, my eyes scanning things that weren't there. What's going on? She asked. Talk to me. I can't, I said. My voice was almost a whisper. Just pray, please. I can't talk right now. It was hard to explain that I was slipping in and out, not of consciousness, but of my body. One moment I was in the car beside her, the next I was somewhere else entirely, a black void without walls, without light, without time. Then I'd be yanked back into my body, only to feel the crushing pressure again, and I'd dive back into prayer just to keep from drowning in it. The ride home felt endless. Every turn of the tires seemed to echo, as though the road itself was amplifying the weight in my chest. She kept glancing over, worry deepening in her eyes. I couldn't look at her. I couldn't look at anything. I just kept whispering prayers between gasps for breath, trying to hold the line against something I couldn't see but could feel closing in. By the time we pulled into our driveway, I knew one thing. I hadn't outrun it. I'd brought it with me. The moment I stepped into our bedroom, my legs gave way. I didn't ease down, I collapsed, the carpet pressing up against my cheek, my pulse hammering in my ears. My body felt both impossibly heavy and terrifyingly light, like I could fall upward if I wasn't careful. And then, the shift. The walls, the bed, the carpet, they dissolved. I was somewhere else, not just in my head, not in a hallucination. My spirit knew the difference. At first, it was only blackness, not the blackness of a closed room, but the blackness of an infinite abyss, a nothingness that somehow felt full of awareness, full of judgment. Then I realized I wasn't floating, I was being held. I looked down, or maybe it was down, in some way the human body doesn't understand, and saw that I was lying in a massive hand, fingers like pillars curved around me, not crushing but containing. I was small there, utterly helpless, and I knew without anyone telling me, this is the hand of the living God. Hebrews says it is a dreadful thing to fall into his hands, and in that moment, dreadful was too soft a word. It wasn't fear in the way you fear a predator. It was fear in the way a candle might fear the sun, the awareness that you exist entirely at the mercy of something immeasurably greater. To my right, I saw them, a cluster of demons, maybe 20 or 30. They stood like accusers in a courtroom, their forms shifting in the darkness, their eyes locked on me. One of them stepped forward, larger than the rest, voice like cold iron scraping stone. "We're tired of this one," he said. "He keeps coming into our kingdom and taking people out. And now, he came back and ate from our table." The words hit me like a verdict being read aloud. My mind reeled. Oh God, what have I done? On my left, I could see the kingdom. It wasn't blinding in full glory. It was veiled, as if a thin white cloth hung between us, letting me see the shapes and the light without overwhelming me completely. And yet, even veiled, it radiated life. Beneath me, beyond the palm that held me, I could sense an endless drop, an abyss that made every part of me recoil. I didn't have to be told what would happen if I slipped. The accuser's words hung in the air, and I felt the truth of them like a weight on my chest. I had eaten from their table, I'd stepped willingly into their territory, and now they were claiming legal right to me. In that hand, I couldn't fight, couldn't bargain, I could only plead. My voice, or maybe my soul, cried out, "God, have mercy. Lord, forgive me." Every breath was a gift, and I knew it. And in that moment, I realized, in the most literal way, that my life was not mine to keep. It was his to give, or take, moment by moment. The longer I lay in that hand, the more I understood. This wasn't just a moment of personal crisis. This was legal territory. I was in a courtroom older than creation itself. I couldn't hear everything, but I could feel it. A trial was underway. The presence of law, of order, of an unshakable justice system far beyond any earthly court. To my right, the demons clustered like prosecuting attorneys, each face marked with hunger and certainty. The largest of them, the one who had spoken before, stood with an air of confidence, as though the case was already won. "This one," he said again, his voice curling in the darkness, "entered our kingdom without permission. He took from our table. He broke the law. We have the right to claim him." The words weren't bluster. They were claims backed by a dark, twisted legality. I felt their weight in my bones. They were right. I had broken the law, not man's law, but the law of the Spirit. I had opened the door and given them grounds. To my left, the kingdom stood like a jury that needed no deliberation. The angels, witnesses in radiant armor, didn't smile, didn't speak. Their faces were solemn, their gaze steady. It was clear they saw every detail, every motive, without distortion. The distance between the two sides was the breadth of the hand I lay in, and yet it felt like the span between eternity and damnation. My breathing was shallow. I could feel my organs tightening inside me, as though life itself was slowly being wrung out. Even when I managed to breathe, It wasn't from my own strength. It was because a breath was given to me. I could see them sometimes. These breaths, coming like small beams of light from somewhere above. I'd inhale, desperate, and then wait, knowing it might be another minute before the next one came. I was exhausted. Fighting in this place drained you in a way nothing on earth could. It wasn't just physical fatigue. It was the weariness of your very soul. And yet, in the middle of that exhaustion, something in me shifted. My prayers stopped being about survival. My thoughts turned outward, to my wife, my family, the people I'd been called to reach. God, I whispered into the vastness. I need to be here for them. Forget about me. Let me stay for their sake. It was a strange moment, as if heaven itself leaned in to listen. And though the darkness still pressed close, I felt, not release yet, but the faint tremor of hope, like the air before dawn. When I shifted my focus away from myself and toward those I loved, something in the atmosphere cracked. It wasn't a dramatic shatter, more like the smallest fracture in a sheet of ice. But in the silence of that abyss, even the smallest change felt monumental. The suffocating grip that had wrapped my chest for what felt like hours began to ease. Just slightly. I could breathe deeper, if only for a moment. And then I felt them, the witnesses. Out of the darkness, shapes emerged, not the accusing kind, not the twisted shadows from my right. These were robed in light, their outlines shimmering as if woven from threads of fire. 6 or 7 figures surrounded me, forming a circle. They didn't look at me with pity or anger. They prayed. It was prayer unlike anything I'd ever heard. It wasn't desperate. It wasn't pleading. It was certain. Every syllable carried the authority of heaven, as if each word was being etched into reality. I felt their prayers moving through me, strengthening what little was left of my resolve. The hopelessness that had been my constant companion here began to thin. And then the air shifted again. Every presence, angel and demon alike, turned their attention toward something beyond us. It was like a shadow passed over everything, but it wasn't darkness. It was the shadow of a cross. I couldn't see all of it, not in detail, but I knew what it was. I knew the symbol that had been mocked, minimized, and misunderstood for centuries now stood in perfect clarity. The hand that held me seemed to steady, and then, from the veiled kingdom to my left, a figure began to walk forward. Even before his face came into view, my spirit recognized him. The presence was undeniable. Jesus stepped out of the light, closed the distance, and put his arm around me. He didn't ask questions. He didn't demand explanations. "This one is mine," he said. "He belongs to me." Every being in that place, in heaven's light and hell's shadow, heard it, and not one could argue. The moment his arm wrapped around me, the trial was over, not because the accusers had withdrawn their claims, but because their claims no longer mattered. When Jesus speaks ownership over you, no power in heaven, earth, or under the earth has the authority to overrule it. I could feel it ripple through the courtroom. The demons, once bristling with confidence, now held in a silent, frustrated stillness. The angels in the kingdom didn't cheer, didn't shout. Their very posture was the celebration. It was the calm certainty of victory already secured. And then I understood why the cloud of witnesses had gathered before he came. They weren't just praying for my rescue. They were preparing the ground for his arrival. Their intercession had been the banner announcing, "The King is coming." The shadow of the cross still hung above us. It wasn't looming in menace, but anchoring everything in that space. Every set of eyes, angelic and demonic alike, was fixed on it, not because it was unfamiliar, but because it was the undeniable center of all reality. I thought about how, on earth, we wear the cross around our necks or print it on church walls, often forgetting the sheer gravity it carries in the unseen realm. Here, in this place, its authority was absolute. Jesus didn't lecture me. He didn't scold. There was a faint smile, the kind you give a child who's just learned the hard way that the stove is hot. But there was also something deeper in his expression. Relief, love that was unshaken by my failure. This one is mine, he said again, slower this time, like a seal being pressed into wax, and I knew that every syllable was being recorded in eternity. We turned, not hurried, not stumbling, and began to walk. And as we did, the hand that had held me slowly released, lowering me back towards something familiar. The blackness thinned, the weight in my chest shifted, and then the deliverance began. It wasn't gentle. My body lurched forward, and I began to vomit, deep, wrenching heaves that felt like they were pulling my very insides out. 3 full grocery bags later, I collapsed again, every muscle limp, as though I'd been wrung dry. But underneath the exhaustion, something else was stirring. Peace. Not the fragile kind that waits for the next problem, but the kind that says, the worst is over. The peace didn't carry me back to my body all at once. Instead, I felt myself rising, not in a rush, but in a slow, deliberate ascent into light. The darkness fell away like mist burned off by the morning sun, and I found myself in a place that was unmistakably heaven, yet still veiled. The colors were alive, but muted, as if their full brilliance was being gently withheld. Shapes and forms were clear, but I sensed that if I saw their glory unfiltered, it would undo me completely. And then there he was again, Jesus, walking just ahead of me. He turned, smiling with that same knowing gentleness I had seen in the courtroom. Maybe we shouldn't do that again, bro, he said. It wasn't sarcasm, and it wasn't stern. It was the kind of humor that lives inside unconditional love, the reminder that he had been with me even through my rebellion. His words carried no accusation, just the warmth of someone who had already paid the price for my rescue. But as we walked, I began to notice the faces around us. Beings clothed in light, the host of heaven, were watching. They didn't greet me with open arms. They didn't rush forward in welcome. Some shook their heads, others looked away. It was a strange, piercing feeling to be under the arm of the king, claimed as his own, and yet to sense the disappointment of his household. Shame rose in me like a tide. I thought of every reason they might feel it, the recklessness, the presumption, the needless danger. I didn't feel accused by them, but I felt the weight of my own actions, as if seeing them through their eyes. Psalm 73:25 came to me without effort. Whom have I in heaven but you? And there's none upon earth that I desire beside you. I realized it in that moment. It didn't matter if the host of heaven approved of me or not. Their loyalty wasn't to me, it was to him. And because they loved him, they would stand by his choice to keep me. But knowing that didn't lift the heaviness in my chest. I felt unworthy to be here. I didn't want to speak, to explain, to justify. I whispered into the light, "Please, Lord, just let me worship." The moment I whispered, "Just let me worship," it was as if my body, if you could even call it that here, dropped to the lowest place I could find in heaven. One instant, I stood beside Jesus under the gaze of the host. The next, I was kneeling in what felt like the farthest, humblest corner of his kingdom, my face pressed to the floor, my hands open, my words reduced to one refrain: Hallelujah, Hallelujah, Hallelujah. Every breath felt borrowed, and I didn't dare use it for anything but praise. In the back of my mind was the memory of those moments in the abyss, when every inhale had been an act of mercy, given to me deliberately by God. I wasn't going to waste a single one now. I didn't want to preach. I didn't want to explain. I didn't even want to lift my head. I only wanted to stay there, unnoticed, hidden in worship. But heaven has its own plans. At some point, I don't know how long, I felt him near again. Jesus came down to where I was, his presence filling that low place as naturally as light fills a shadow. He didn't yank me up, he sat with me, and in a way that bypassed words entirely. I knew what he was saying. It's over. The condemnation is gone. You're forgiven. Move forward from this moment. When I rose again to walk beside him, the heaviness was different. Not guilt anymore, but the weight of being loved beyond reason. And then it began. I don't know if we were walking, flying, or simply being shown things as they existed, but suddenly I was being given knowledge, not in pieces, not in a slow drip, but in floods. Revelation after revelation, truth upon truth about heaven, earth, eternity, the way things truly are. It was exhilarating at first. The joy was unlike anything I'd felt on earth, but it came so fast, so pure, that my being couldn't contain it. The more I received, the more I felt like I might burst apart under the sheer goodness of it. "Stop," I whispered, then louder. "Stop!" Not because I didn't want more, but because I sensed that if one more truth entered me, it would undo me completely. I thought of Paul's words, unspeakable things, unlawful for a man to utter. I understood now. This wasn't just about secrecy, it was about capacity. The human soul, even in its redeemed state, can only bear so much glory before it needs the mercy of limits. And for the first time since the darkness began, I felt an odd longing for earth, not because I preferred it, but because its veil, its smallness, was a kindness, reality, with all its imperfections, protects us from being destroyed by the full weight of eternity. The flood of revelation slowed, like a tide pulling back from the shore. The light dimmed, not in brightness, but in intensity, until it was once again something I could bear without trembling apart. I felt my awareness settling, gravity returning in a way that had nothing to do with the physical. My spirit was descending, easing back toward the boundaries of flesh and time. When my eyes opened, I was in my bedroom again. The air was still, the carpet beneath my palms familiar. My chest rose and fell with a rhythm I could trust again. The crushing weight was gone, replaced by a peace that wasn't fragile, but solid. For 3 days afterward, I barely spoke, not because I was afraid to talk, but because words felt clumsy compared to what I'd just seen. I had told myself I'd never preach again, never put my voice forward after seeing how recklessly I'd risked everything. But in time, the call to speak returned. God reminded me, I still want you to preach the gospel. This time, do it from what you now know. And what I knew was this: every breath you take is an act of mercy. Not once in that abyss did I breathe by accident. Each inhale was handed to me, one by one, by a God who owed me nothing and gave me everything. I also knew that Jesus' forgiveness is not like ours. He didn't make me crawl back in shame. He didn't keep me in the shadows until I'd proven myself. The moment he claimed me, it was settled, forever. His love wasn't diminished by my failure. And I knew, without a shred of doubt, that psychedelics are not a neutral tool. They are a door. You may think you are walking through it in control, armed with curiosity or even spiritual intent. But the moment you cross that threshold, you've entered a courtroom where you are not the judge. The devil doesn't care if he traps you with heroin or with a mushroom trip dressed in the language of healing. Chains are chains, whether they're 10 feet long or 100. And the most dangerous chains are the ones you don't recognize as bondage. I think about the cultural tide today. Ayahuasca retreats advertised as spiritual awakenings, microdosing presented as self-care, influencers speaking about meeting the divine through plant medicine. The deception is clever because it offers just enough truth to keep you coming back, and just enough lie to keep you bound. If you remember nothing else from my story, remember this: the true God does not require you to eat fungus out of the ground to meet him. He is not hiding himself behind a substance. His presence is not accessed by chemistry, but by surrender. I learned it the hardest way possible. You don't have to.